What does a legend remember when the final chapter draws near, when the last curtain quivers before falling into silence? Not the thunder of applause. Not the glittering nights of Hollywood, not even the titles that crowned him in history. No. What Robert Redford carried in those last days were 7 women, etched like constellations he could not stop tracing. At 89, standing at the edge of eternity, he unburdened a secret he had held close for a lifetime. Each name was not just a memory but a wound, a spark, a whisper of love that refused to fade. Passion that burned too brightly, loss that never stopped aching, tenderness that haunted him until the end. Behind the golden icon lived not a myth but a man, bearing scars applause could never quiet. Before we begin, let us honor him. A red heart, a silent prayer, a final salute to one of the greats whose light does not go out, only travels farther. He could have begun with dazzling names, the co-stars whose faces blazed across marquees, goddesses whose images defined an era. But the first woman engraved into Robert Redford's soul was not a starlet draped in glamour. It was Lola Van Wagenen, the quiet historian who walked into his life before the world knew his name. Before there was the Sundance Kid, before Oscars, before his face became a golden emblem of American cinema, there was simply Bob restless, searching, stumbling through sketches, mistakes, and shadows. Lola's intelligence was quiet but absolute, her belief in him steadier than any spotlight. She gave him what the world never could, home. They met in the late 1950s, when Redford was still an anonymous 22, still grieving his mother, still scarred by illness, still battling the reckless drinking and despair that could have unraveled him before life properly began. Into that chaos stepped Lola. She didn't see a matinee idol or a myth. She saw Bob, the fragile, brilliant, wounded soul who needed grounding. He would later admit that without her, those years might have swallowed him whole. Their 1958 marriage was as modest as love stories come. No champagne fountains, no Hollywood glare. Borrowed furniture, threadbare budgets, and the fierce hope of 2 young people who believed, perhaps naively, that love alone could shield them. Without her, he once confessed, I might have been lost. And I mean lost in every way a man can be. Lola Van Wagenen was not the Hollywood goddess with her face on billboards, nor the glamorous co-star audiences dreamed beside him. She was rarer. She was proof that even legends begin as men, fragile, flawed, desperate for love, stability, and grace. She saw Robert Redford not as myth, but as Bob, the restless boy who might never have survived without her anchor. Though their paths diverged, her presence lingered like an unhealed scar, living in the cadence of his voice, in the weight behind his silences, in the tenderness he carried even at his hardest edges. For Robert Redford, Lola was not merely a chapter. She was the foundation of the book, the name written first and deepest, the name too indelible to fade, the name that echoed unspoken when the final curtain began to fall. After Lola, there were women who passed through Redford's life, shadows of tenderness, fleeting fires of passion, but none etched themselves into his soul the way Natalie Wood did. Her very name shimmered like a promise of Hollywood's golden age. And yet for Redford, she was never just the star on the marquee. She was the wound he would carry in silence, a loss no time could mend. They met as professional equals in the early 1960s, when Redford was still clawing his way past the curse of his looks too pretty to be taken seriously. The casting directors sneered, while Natalie was already a crown jewel whose childhood had been tied to the studio system. On Inside, Daisy Clover, 1965, and again on This Property is Condemned, 1966, their chemistry burned itself into celluloid, his quiet restlessness drawn to her luminous vulnerability. Audiences saw the golden boy and the fragile dreamer. Off-screen, they were simply Bob and Natalie. In late-night rehearsals and whispered conversations, they found the kind of solace that doesn't need explaining, the relief of being seen as human, not as myth. Redford once confided to a friend, she carried light, but you could feel the shadow behind it. He admired her resilience, sensed the storms fame had taught her to bury but never quiet. And then came 1981, the night that would carve itself into Hollywood's darkest memory. Natalie Wood, only 43, was gone, lost to black water off Catalina. To the tabloids, it was a scandal. To Redford, devastation without remedy. When her name surfaced in interviews, his voice slowed, softened. His gaze went distant, reaching for a thing too delicate to expose. Those who listened closely heard the truth he never said aloud. Her absence haunted him not as gossip, but as a hollow that had carved itself into his core. In his memory, Natalie remained luminous, forever young, forever poised at the brink of promise, yet forever absent. She became part of the private theatre of ghosts he carried: Lola, Scott, Jamie, Newman, and her. Together they formed the constellation of love and loss that shaped not the legend but the man. The next unforgettable presence was not a lover in shadows but a storm across the screen: Barbra Streisand. By the early 70s, Redford had become Hollywood's golden boy, his face a shorthand for effortless grace. Streisand was his opposite: raw power, unfiltered passion, a presence that refused to be ignored. When they collided in The Way We Were 1973, it wasn't merely casting, it was an event. On screen they became Katie and Hubble, two souls pulled together with irresistible force, only to be torn apart by the weight of who they were. Her every glance, a hunger for something permanent, his silences and hesitations stretching the space between them until it hurt. Fire and ice. A collision so true audiences left theaters shaken, convinced they'd witnessed love in its purest, most devastating form. Not a story of happy endings, but of a love too powerful to survive, and in that pain lay its truth. For Redford, the performance was transformative. Streisand's intensity stripped away the untouchable golden aura and revealed a man who could break, long lose. Decades later, The Way We Were remained etched not just as a triumph, but as a beautiful wound, a reminder that some connections live only in memory. She would later call him the Golden Boy. He, private as ever, let respect do the talking. She was not the wife who anchored his youth, nor the partner who shared his days, but she became the ache of what love can be when it is too strong to last. If Streisand embodied a love that could survive only on film, the next woman was the opposite. Passion lived in flesh and fire, a storm that defied any script: Sônia Braga. By the late 1980s, Redford had conquered the world: Oscar-winning director, box office titan, cultural icon, yet behind the golden facade stretched a hollow ache, a man in midlife, long divorced, scarred by graves and distances. Into that emptiness walked Sônia, and with her a flame so fierce it nearly consumed him. She was unlike anyone he had known: Brazilian, world-made, fearless. Dona Flor and her two husbands had made her a phenomenon. Kiss of the Spider-Woman proved her a force of nature, sensual, unsparing, gloriously alive. To the public she was magnetic, to Redford overwhelming. Where his life had been defined by control, she was abandoned. Where he wore silence as armor, she wielded passion like fire. The connection was instant, electric. Friends called their time together a whirlwind, two worlds colliding with a ferocity neither could resist. Nights of intoxicating laughter, heat so sharp it felt dangerous. A man in his 50s rediscovering the reckless fever he thought gone forever. Redford never built a life with her, but he never forgot her either, because some flames extinguished burn forever in memory. If Sônia Braga was the wildfire that consumed Robert Redford in midlife, then Jane Fonda was something altogether different: a slow-burning flame that never went out, a connection hovering on the line between friendship and the haunting ache of almost love. Their story began in the 1960s, when both were still unproven, daring to carve space in an industry that punished nonconformity. He was the reluctant golden boy, resenting the too pretty label. She was defiance made flesh bold, political, unwilling to let the machine swallow her voice. They were opposites that should never have fit, and yet they did quietly. Not a scandal, not headlines. An intimacy without claim. Their first pairing, Barefoot in the Park, 1967, was sold as romantic comedy, but audiences sensed something deeper, the warmth, the lived-in way they moved around each other. Off-screen, Jane's sharp courage loosened Robert's guardedness, his steadiness gave her shelter. They built a trust so unshakable it frightened him, because he knew how fragile such trust becomes once tested by desire. A decade later, in The Electric Horseman, 1979, the current was still there, older, weathered, no less electric. And then came Our Souls at Night, 2017, two aging neighbors feeling their way toward late-life intimacy. What played out wasn't just script, it was confession. 50 years of what-if flickering in their eyes, the way her hand lingered a beat too long, the way his gaze softened as if trying to say what he had never dared. It wasn't acting, it was memory, longing, resignation. Jane would later admit she'd been in love. Redford never confirmed it, but his silence said enough. Friends said he feared one wrong step would destroy something rare, so he kept it untouched, preserved. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps he was wrong. What remains is the ache of possibly the cruelest ache of all. She was not the wife who anchored him, nor the lover who consumed him. She was the almost love that lingered for a lifetime, the gentle shadow behind his triumphs, the unanswered question in his twilight. By the late 1990s, when Sibylle Szaggars entered his life, he was no longer the restless golden boy or the untouchable box-office titan. He was a man marked by scars, children buried too soon, a marriage worn thin by distance, decades of fame that brought everything except peace. Into that quiet came Sibylle, a German-born artist whose world was shaped by paint and light, installations that spoke of rain and earth, and a devotion to the environment that mirrored his own. She wasn't dazzled by his legend, nor did she seek its glow. She arrived with her own brilliance. Where others had been fired, she was calm water. Where others demanded, she offered space. Meeting her was like stepping into a meadow after years of tangled forest. At last he could simply be Bob, not the Sundance Kid, not the director, not the icon, but a man still scarred, still searching, suddenly allowed to rest. Their bond didn't ignite in spectacle, it deepened like roots, threading into the soil of shared solitude. In Santa Fe and Sundance, they built sanctuaries of simplicity, studios filled with Sibylle's canvases, sketchpads scattered with his drawings, evenings softened by music, and silences that felt like prayer. In 2009, at 73, he married her in Hamburg, Germany. He described it in disarmingly plain words. It feels like a new life, a revelation from a man who had carried storms so long. Together they created The Way of the Rain, her vision, his voice. To audiences it was art, to them it was covenant. When he spoke on stage over her images of water and sky, Redford wasn't performing, he was confessing a soul, finally at rest. In his twilight, as steps slowed and voice softened, Sibylle was the steady flame at his side. She absorbed his silences, carried his memories, and gave him the gift life had so often denied him, peace. With her, love was no longer wildfire to survive, but shelter to inhabit quiet fulfillment, completion. She was not the anchor of his beginning, nor the spark of youthful longing. She was something rarer, the healing rain at the end of a long road, the companion who turned grief into stillness. For Robert Redford, she was not just the last love. She was the love that made every silence bearable. And then came September 16, 2025. Under the endless Utah sky he cherished like scripture, Robert Redford drew his final breath at home in Sundance. The desert air was sharp, the twilight held its breath. Beside him, Sibylle's hand locked around his, as if touch could bargain with time. When the warmth left his skin, a world collapsed, not the world of headlines, but hers.